Into the Abyss, the Jascon 4 tragedy, a life at sea. Harrison Okene had spent years working on ships. As a cook, he wasn't the most celebrated member of the crew, but he took pride in his work. He made sure his fellow seafarers had hot meals to keep their spirits up during the grueling, endless days at sea. His wife, Okene, often worried about him. Every time he set sail, she made him promise to return, and every time he laughed and assured her he would. He never expected this voyage to be different. The Jascon 4 was a relatively small tugboat supporting a Chevron oil platform off the Nigerian coast. Its job was crucial, keeping the massive oil rigs in place against the relentless ocean currents. The work was demanding, but it was steady, and the crew was a tight-knit group of men who had spent months together on the water. The night before disaster struck, Harrison had spoken to Okene on the phone. She had teased him about missing her cooking and begged him to come home soon. "I'll bring you something sweet when I return," he had promised, chuckling. He had no idea that this time, returning home would be a fight against death itself. The sinking. The storm came suddenly, as they often did in the Gulf of Guinea. Thick, dark clouds swallowed the sky, turning the ocean into a rolling mass of black and silver. The wind howled, lashing against the Jascon 4 like an angry beast. Harrison had finished cleaning the galley and was settling into bed, stripped down to just his boxers. He had barely closed his eyes when an enormous boom thundered through the hull, followed by an ear-splitting crack. The ship lurched violently, tossing him against the wall. He heard a deep, terrifying groan, the sound of metal bending, breaking under immense pressure. Shouting erupted from above deck. Harrison bolted upright. His instincts screamed at him to move, but before he could react, the floor tilted beneath him. His small cabin became a death trap as water rushed in, icy and relentless. In an instant, the power went out, plunging everything into a terrifying blackness. He gasped, feeling the water clawing at his legs, rising too fast. His hands flailed, searching for anything to hold on to. Then, the world turned upside down. A horrific sensation of weightlessness took over as the Jascon 4 capsized, flipping completely before being dragged down by the ocean. Harrison was torn from his bunk, flung against the steel walls like a rag doll. He opened his mouth to scream, but salt water poured in, burning his throat. Somewhere above, or was it below, his crewmates were screaming. Then, silence, trapped in the abyss. When Harrison's senses returned, he realized he was still alive. But the ship had settled beneath the ocean, completely inverted, and he was trapped inside. His hands trembled as he reached up and touched air. A small pocket of breathable space had formed in his cabin, a miracle in the drowning darkness. But the water was still rising. His chest heaved with panic. He forced himself to think, "I have to get higher." Feeling his way through the blackness, he found a door frame and pushed upward, gasping as he pulled himself into a slightly larger space, perhaps a hallway or another room. His foot brushed against something soft in the water. He recoiled, heart pounding. A body. He swallowed a scream. Harrison had no way of knowing how many of his crewmates had perished, but deep down, he feared he was alone. And the worst part? No one knew he was here. The waiting game. Hours passed, or maybe days. He couldn't tell. The darkness was absolute, the silence suffocating. Harrison's body ached from the cold. His fingers wrinkled from the water that still lapped at his chest. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, But thirst was worse. His throat was raw, burning. The air in the pocket grew thick, poisoned with oil and sweat. He whispered prayers to himself, over and over, gripping onto sanity like a lifeline. God, please don't let me die here. God, please let someone find me. The cold crept into his bones. He thought of Akpavona, of the life they had planned together. Would she ever know what happened to him? Or would he simply vanish beneath the waves, another sailor lost to the sea? Then, on what must have been the third day, a sound pierced the darkness. Rescue from the deep. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. A faint clanking against the metal hull. He held his breath. Then, another clank. A rhythmic tapping. Hope exploded in his chest. He slammed his fists against the wall, sending desperate bangs back toward the sound. Silence. Then, a knockback. A sob burst from his throat. Someone was there. The next few minutes were agonizing. The sounds of movement, of divers cutting through the wreck, echoed through the ship. Then, suddenly, a beam of light pierced the darkness. A hand reached out. The diver recoiled in shock. Later, they would admit they had only expected to recover bodies. Instead, they had found a living man, trapped in a shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean. Harrison clutched the diver's arm, his first human contact in days. Tears streaked his salt-stained face as the diver signaled for backup. He was going home. The sole survivor. Harrison Okene was the only survivor of the Jascon 4. His miraculous survival baffled experts. The science behind how he lived, how the air pocket sustained him for 3 days, how he didn't succumb to hypothermia or carbon dioxide poisoning, was unbelievable. But Harrison knew the truth. It was willpower. It was faith. It was the desperate, unbreakable desire to live. When he finally stepped onto land, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by men who called him a miracle, he made a silent vow. He would never take another breath for granted, and he would never, ever go back to sea.